Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, we are going to talk about post-colonial theory here. It's one of the important theory, and we have to be very much clear and careful while interpretation it. Most of the time, people misinterpret this word post-colonial. They said that post means after, colonial means colonialism. So some incident that happened after colonialism, that's called post-colonial. It's not like this one, it's different one. So generally speaking, if I can say post-colonial, the word apparently what its meaning is, what its interpretation is, there we can find hell of difference there. It's not the same one as people think it, that what is post-colonial theory. It's actually reactions. It in the world, either in Africa, French were the usurpers. They controlled over many countries there and subcontinent. Britishers were here. They have been ruler for more than 100 years, and they ruled over here. And during that particular rule, they instilled a particular mindset. Especially in that mindset, there was a concept of power, inequality. So people who were ruled, they were considered inferior. Their culture was considered subordinate. Their language was not given equal status, and their race, their religion, everything was lower in we can say status. So people started reacting it, and interestingly, initially, all that sort of theories came from the Western, those who were white. But later, with the passage of time, local people, like just like Homi Ke Baba, and a lot of other people from India and from Gayatri Vivek, and many other people later, they emerged there and they talked about the reactions, how people were treated, and what were the feelings, and what were thinking, and why that sort of inordinate sort of things were created between the ruler and the ruled. That thing mattered a lot. So, post-colonial theory is a body of thought primarily concerned with accounting for the political, aesthetic, economic, historical, and social impact of the European colonial rule around the world in the 18th throughout the 20th century, from 18th to we can see. But actually, this process started in 16th or 17th century, and it ended by 18th century, in 1940s. After Second World War, it ended there, and but works were started. Feelings were captured during that area, especially as I have told you, that there exists a dichotomy that initial post-colonial writer were the white one. If you can remember, in graduation, there is Shooting an Elephant by George Orwell was a post-colonial sort of writing, where however Sahab is still, interestingly, in our language we use the word Sahab, and still we have one particular group of mental setup where certain people are regarded superior and other are regarded inferior. So, postcolonial theory is the critical academic study of the cultural legacy of colonialism and imperialism. Imperialism is not direct control, it is indirect control, what we call it imperialism, focusing on the human consequences of the control and exploitation of colonized people and their rights. We can say the Palestinian American culture critic Edward Said was the major figure of post colonial thought. Uh, and his book Orientalism was actually East and West. The bifurcation that exists between East and West, where East was considered dark, uneducated, bogus, having a lot of problems, and West was so similarly. If I can see the word, there is white man's burden. The people of East were considered, or Africa were considered by white man's burden. It was the duty of white man to civilize them, to change them, to make them behave particularly in a particular way. So that is what we can say Orientalism, and but if we can go back, if we can study this book, we can see actually it was all wrong. It was a propaganda just to legalize, or just to have their firm control or hegemony over the people of East. So was a major figure post-colonial thought, and his book Orientalism is often credited as its founding text. Other important post-colonial critics include Homike Bhabha and Guthrie Spivak and Franz Fanon. So these are important persons who worked for the sake of indigenous cultures and the thinking and their thought and their reactions, their aesthetic movements, their cultural, each and everything has been described there. So basic tenets of post-colonial theory, we can say appropriate appropriation of colonial language. Post-colonial writers have this thing they like to do. Meta-narrative, colonialism, colonial discourse, rewriting history, decolonization struggles, nationhood and nationalization, valorization of cultural identity. These are certain important aspects, themes which have been debated, which have been discussed, which have been brought forth by the important propellants and important scholars of post colonial theory. One by one, they brought these things ahead. So, if we go back once again towards post colonial theory holds that decolonized people develop a post colonial identity that's based on cultural interaction between different identities. For instance, the West and East, the Britishers and the subcontinent people, they have a lot of differences. These differences were cultural, national, and ethnic as well as gender and class based. And one group was considered superior, another inferior, and a lot of taboos were assigned with the local people, indigenous communities, their languages, which are assigned varying degrees of social power by the colonial society. So, post colonial critics reinterpret and examine the values of literary text by focusing on the context in which they were produced and reveal the colonial ideologies that are concealed within. Their ideology is just like a sahab should act like a sahab. We can say we have studied, if we read between the lines, if critically we evaluate shooting an elephant. Just it's an instance. A lot of other texts are also available there because I'm referring it because you might have studied in your graduation. Post-colonial has many common motifs and themes like cultural dominance, racism, quest for identity, inequality, along with certain peculiar presentation styles. Most of the post-colonial writers reflected and demonstrated many thematic concepts which are quite connected with both colonizers and colonized. So, rift between the difference, the ups and downs, the unequal distribution of you, each and everything between this, we can say, the ruler and the ruled. So, post colonialism, we can see the historical period or state of affairs representing aftermath of Western colonialism. The term can also be used to describe the concurrent project to reclaim and rethink the history and agency of people subordinated under various forms of imperialism. Post colonialism signals a possible future of overcoming colonialism, yet new forms of domination and subordination can come in the wake of such changes, including new forms of global empire. Post colonialism should not be confused with the claim that the world we live in now is actually devoid of colonialism. Still, colonialism is there, but it has changed its shape, its form. Still, it exists there one way or the other. Still, people are being controlled, being ruled in one way or the other. Post colonial theorists and historians have been concerned with investigating the various trajectories of modernity as understood and experienced from a range of philosophical, cultural, and historical perspective. They have been particularly concerned with engaging with the ambiguous legacy of the Enlightenment as expressed in social, political, economic, scientific, legal, and cultural thought beyond Europe itself. So this legacy is ambiguous according to post-colonial theorists, because the age of enlightenment was also an age of empire, and the connection between those two historical epochs is more than incidental. So from decolonization to post-colonialism. So, although there were and many different kinds of imperialism, colonialization, post-colonialism, and thus of decolonization, two of the most important periods of those who study post-colonialism include the British disengagement from its second empire of the 19th and 20th century, and the decolonization movements of the 1960s and 70s, which started later in Africa and elsewhere. It was during the later era, in particular, that many of the international principles and instruments of decolonization were formally declared, although the history of their emergence and formation goes back much further, and that the language of national self determination was applied to liberation movements with within former colonial territories. The process triggered by those strugglers were not only political and economic but also cultural, because it has also impact on culture too. Previously, subjugated individuals sought to assert control over not only territorial boundaries, albeit one carved out by the imperial powers, but also the language and history. So, the term post colonialism is also sometimes used to refer to the struggles of indigenous people in many parts of the world in the early 21st century, too. However, given the interpretation of the principles of self determination and self government within the international system, along with the minority status and vulnerability of those peoples, even within decolonized states, the term is perhaps less tapped. At that time, the indigenous people were denied even the modest gains extended by the United Nations and the international system of states to the various decolonized territories in 1970s. Moreover, the history of the imperialism is complex. European imperialism between the 16th and 18th century in the Americas, the West Indies, Australia, and Southeast Asia was substantially different from that of the 19th and 20th centuries. Still, one of the central themes of post colonial scholarship is the persistence of empire and resistance to it in human history. Persistence versus resistance. That's the important thing we can find in post colonialism. Thus, on one hand, the legacy of the Enlightenment forms an indispensable and unavoidable feature of the present, whether European or otherwise. The universal categories and the concepts at the heart of much Enlightenment thought have been put to work for both societies as well as imperialism itself. So there's a tradition of anti-imperialist criticism that extends as far back as the 16th century and set. So here we can see that this is not something new. If we go back, Enlightenment age is there, and many European writers they walked over it, and with the passage of time, they resisted and overpowered these things. Have been debated. They one the subaltern, those who couldn't raise their voices, they were given tongues, they were given voices, and that all in literature, especially in theories and media, in different ways, people were given tongues, people were given voices, and that is the start of what we can say post-colonial theories. So a lot of theorists were there. Edward Said, Fanon, as I have told you, or Gathri Spivak. These were important people who talked for their nationalism, for their cultural safety, and for their people. So, what's the subject of post-colonial theory? As a general domain of intellectual inquiry, post-colonialism addresses those questions that emerge in relation to the aftermath of imperialism. One of the most important features of the history of imperialism has been the emergence of states, either from the consolidation of territories and polities, or from dissolution of empires for some combination therefore. And along with that, new conceptions of international border. In that sense, to be concerned with postcolonialism is to be concerned with a set of questions at the heart of modern political thought. So, notable postcolonial theoreticians and theories. Franz Fanon talked about subjugation. Edward Said talked about Orientalism. Gary Spivak, the subaltern talk. Homi K. Baba, hybridity, he talked about it. Siva Kumar, alternative modernity. And Dipesh Chakravarti, so Derek Gregory, and other colonial present. And Amar Acharya, and classical influences we can find there. These are the people who worked for the rights of indigenous people, their culture, their language, and their method. So, front fauna and subjugation. In the Wretched of the Earth, the satirist and philosopher Franz Fanon analyzes and medically describes the nature of colonization as essentially destructive. Its societal effects, the imposition of subjugating colonial identity, it's harmful to the mental health of the native people who were subjugated into colonies. Fanon writes that the ideological essence of colonialism is the systematic denial of all attributes of humanity or the colonized people. Such dehumanization is achieved with physical and mental violence, by which the colonist means to inculcate a servile mentality upon the natives. So, for Fanon, the native most violently resist colonial and subjugation. Hence, Fanon describes violent resistance to the colonialism as mentally cathartic practice which purges colonial civility from the native psyche and restores self-respect to the subjugated. Thus, Fanon actively supported and participated in the Algerian Revolution for independence from France as a member and representative of that movement. So, as a post-colonial praxis, Fanon's mental health analysis of colonialism and imperialism and the supposing economic theories were partly derived from the essay Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where Vladimir Lenin described colonial imperialism as an advanced form of capitalism, this desperate for growth at all costs, and so requires more and more humans' exploitation to ensure continually consistent profit for investment. And the next important person, theorist, is Edward Said, and his work is Orientalism. Cultural critic Edward Said is considered as Ethan Jr. as the originator and inspiring patron saint of postcolonial theory and discourses due to his interpretation of the theory of Orientalism explained in 1978 book Orientalism to describe the us and them binary social relation with which Western Europe intellectually divided the world into the Occident and the Orient side, developed the denotations and connotations of term Orientalism, an art history for Western depictions and the study of the Orient. Size concept, which he also termed Orientalism, is that the cultural representation generally with us and them binary relation are social constructs which are mutually uh, constitutive and cannot exist independent of each other because each exists on account of and for others. Notably, the West created the cultural concept of the East, which, according to Said, allowed the European to suppose the peoples of the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, and the Asia in general from expressing and representing themselves as discrete people and culture. Orientalism thus conflated and reduced non-Western world into the homogeneous cultural entity known as the East. Therefore, in service of the colonial type of imperialism, the us and them Orientalist paradigm allowed European scholars to represent the Oriental world as inferior and backward, irrational and wild, as opposed to the Western Europe that was superior and progressive, rational and civil, the opposite of the Oriental other. Gayatri Spivak, that about the can the Spurgeon talk speak. Spivak also introduced the term essentialism and strategic essentialism to describe the social function of postcolonial theory. Essentialism denotes the perceptual changes inherent to reviving subaltern voices in ways that might simplify the cultural identity of heterogeneous social groups and thereby create stereotyped representation of different identities of the peoples who compose a given social group. Strategic essentialism, on the other hand, denotes a temporary essential group identity used in the praxis of the discourse among people. Furthermore, essentialism can occasionally be applied by so described people to facilitate subalterns communication and being heard and understood because strategic essentialism, a fixed and established subaltern identity, is more readily grasped and accepted by the people majority in the course of intergroup discourse. The important distinction between the term is that strategic essentialism does not ignore the diversity of identities, cultural and ethnic, in a social group, but that in its practical function, strategic essentialism temporarily minimizes intergroup diversity to pragmatically support the essential group identity. And Baba's hybridity in the location of culture, theoretician Homike Baba argues that viewing the human world as composed of separate and unequal culture rather than as an integral human world perpetuates the beliefs in the existence of imaginary peoples and places. Christendom and the Islamic world, first world, second world, and third world. To counter such linguistic and sociological reductionism, post colonial praxis established the philosophic value of the hybrid intellectual spaces, wherein ambiguity adequates truth and authenticity. Therefore, hybridity is philosophic condition that most substantially challenges the ideological validity of colonialism. Siva Kumar's Alternative Modernity. In 1987, the occasion of the 50th anniversary of India's independence, Sindinkan, the making of the contextual modernism, was an important exhibition created by R. Siva Kumar at the National Gallery of Modern Art. In his catalogue essay, Kumar introduced the term contextual modernism, which later emerged as a post-colonial critical tool in the understanding of Indian art, specifically the works of Nandal Bose, Rabindranath Tagore, uh, and Biharis, etc. So here the artists did not believe that the indigenous one has to be historically either in theme or in style, and similarly to be modern one has to adopt a particular transnational formal language or technique. Modernism was to them neither a style nor a form of internationalism. It was critical re-engagement with the foundational aspects of art necessitated by change and one's unique historical positions. And Depeche in Provinciating Europe, depicts Corvarti charts the subaltern history of the Indian struggle for independence and counters Eurocentric Western scholarship about non Western people and cultures by proposing that Western Europe simply be considered as culturally equal to other cultures of the world, that is one region among many to human geography. So Derek Gregory and the colonial present, Derek Gregory argues that the long trajectory through the history of British and American colonization is an ongoing process still happening today in the Colonial present, Gregory traces connection between the geopolitics of events happening in the modern day Afghanistan, Palestine, and Iraq, and links it back to the us and them binary relation between the West and East world. So, building upon the ideas of others and his works on Orientalism, Gregory critiques the economic policy, military apparatus, and transnational corporations as vehicle dividing present day colonialism, emphasizing ideas of discussing ideas around colonialism in present. So, Gregory utilizes modern events such as the September 11 attacks to tell special stories around the colonial behavior happening due to the war on terror. So, Amar, classical influence, Darius argues that colonialism was a capitalist venture moved by the appropriation and plundering of foreign lands and was supported by military force and discourse and legitimized violence in the name of progress and universal civilizing mission. The discourse is complex and multifaceted. It was elaborated in the 19th century by colonial ideologies such as Joseph Ernest Renan and Arthur de Gobineau, but it has roots each far in history. So here we can say three important things. And post-colonial criticism also question the role of the Western literary canon and Western history as dominant forms of knowledge. The terms first world, second world, third world, it has also been discussed. So these are the typical questions that we can see, we can ask there one. So thank you for